The laughter echoed through the training hall of Station Helios 7, bouncing off the metal walls like cheap ammunition. And every alien in the room seemed to find the same joke funny at the exact same moment a human woman had just walked in. And she was carrying what looked like a museum peace cathedral. The 8-foot-tall Vezorian, with natural armor plating covering his body, was the first to speak up, his deep voice rumbling with amusement as he pointed one clawed finger toward the entrance. "Look at what the transport shuttle dragged in," he announced to the gathered cadets. And his mandibles clicked together in what passed for a smile among his species. The woman did not react, and she simply walked toward the equipment setup area with a calm that seemed almost unnatural. Her name was Grace Holloway, and she stood at 5 feet 6 inches with gray eyes that held no particular shine or sparkle, and her brown hair was pulled back in a simple tie that kept it away from her face. She looked ordinary in every way that mattered to the aliens watching her, and that was exactly what made them dismiss her without a second thought. The Joint Galactic Military Training Academy brought together the finest warriors from across known space, and today marked the Advanced Sniper Qualification course that would separate the exceptional from the merely good 12. Species had sent their best marksmen to compete, and each one carried equipment worth more than a small starship. Zorvix, a Sylphine with 4 eyes capable of seeing in spectrums humans could not even imagine, adjusted his plasma-based smart rifle with obvious pride, and the weapon hummed with artificial intelligence systems that could calculate 1,000 variables in a single second. "Perhaps she wandered in from the museum section," Zorvix commented, and his voice carried the musical quality of his species. Though his words dripped with condescension, Grace set down her rifle case on the preparation table, and the case itself looked older than most of the cadets in the room. With scratches and dents that told stories no one present could read, she opened it slowly, and inside lay a kinetic rifle that used actual physical projectiles instead of energy beams or plasma bursts. The laughter grew louder. "Humans really are as primitive as the archives suggest," Catherall said, walking closer to get a better look at her equipment, and his massive shadow fell over Grace like a threatening cloud. "Your species got lucky with your death world, but luck does not make warriors. Soft one." Grace looked up at him for the first time, and her gray eyes met his compound visual organs without flinching, without anger, without anything at all. Then she simply returned to assembling her rifle with hands that moved in practice patterns older than space travel itself from the observation deck above. Sergeant Cole Harris watched the scene unfold with the patience of a man who knew exactly what was about to happen. He was human himself, mid-40s, with a face that carried scars from 3 interstellar conflicts, and he stood with his arms crossed as a Sylphine officer approached him with concern written across her features. "Sergeant Harris," the officer said, her 4 eyes blinking in sequence as she struggled to understand what she was seeing. "Why do you allow this embarrassment to continue? And who authorized this human to participate in our advanced course?" Harris did not answer immediately, and instead he watched Grace finish her rifle assembly with a speed that would have impressed anyone paying actual attention. She was not authorized to participate. "Commander," Harris finally replied, and his voice was quiet enough that the officer had to lean closer to hear him. "And why is she here? And why do you do nothing?" Harris turned to look at the Sylphine officer, and something in his eyes made her take a small step backward. "She is here to evaluate whether your species deserve to learn what she knows," he said. "And I do nothing because there is nothing to do." "Commander, I do not understand." Harris looked back down at Grace, who was now loading her rifle with ammunition she had made herself, each round crafted by hand with a precision that machines could only dream of matching. "She is a living ghost," Harris whispered, and his words carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. "I would tell them to run, but they would not make it far enough for it to matter. The Silphine officer opened her mouth to ask another question, but something in the way Harris spoke made her think better of it down on the training floor. Keth Ral had grown bored of receiving no reaction from the human woman, and he returned to his position with a dismissive wave of his clawed hand. "Let the primitive play with her antique," he announced to the other cadets. "It will make our victory even more glorious when she fails to hit a single target." The other aliens murmured their agreement. And even Zorvix, who prided himself on his scientific objectivity, allowed himself a small smile of superiority. Grace finished her preparations and stood at her designated position, and she looked smaller than ever among the towering forms of alien warriors, each one equipped with technology that could have conquered her entire planet 3 centuries ago. The course instructor, a four-armed Kethany named Voss, stepped forward to address the participants. "The qualification course will test your abilities across 17 scenarios," Voss announced, her voice amplified by the translation systems built into the walls. "Targets will appear at distances ranging from 500 to 4,000 meters, and you will face shifting wind patterns, moving obstacles, and decoy targets mixed with civilian holograms. So a single mistake could mean failure." The alien cadets nodded with confidence, their smart weapons running pre-calculations in the background, their AI systems already mapping the probable target locations. Grace simply breathed, slow and steady, her finger resting beside the trigger guard of her ancient rifle above them all. Sergeant Harris allowed himself the smallest of smiles. He remembered the day he first met Grace Holloway, pinned down behind a burning transport with enemy fire raining from every direction. And he remembered thinking he was going to die on that distant moon. Then the enemy fire had stopped, one shooter at a time, and a voice had come through his radio, telling him to move north toward extraction. He had never seen her take those shots, and neither had anyone else. That was what made her a ghost. And that was why the laughing aliens below had no idea what was about to happen to their understanding of the universe. The first target appeared on the range, and the qualification course began. While the alien cadets rushed to their positions with expensive equipment and arrogant certainty, Grace Holloway remained perfectly still at her station, and her mind drifted to places she rarely allowed herself to visit. The Kepler 442 conflict had lasted 7 years, and it had changed everything the galaxy believed about humanity. She had been 23 when her reconnaissance unit of 12 soldiers dropped behind enemy lines on a moon that had no name, only a designation number that she still remembered in her nightmares. Their mission was supposed to last 3 weeks, and they were supposed to gather intelligence on enemy positions before extraction. The extraction never came for 847 days. Grace and her unit survived in territory controlled by the Rexian Dominion, an empire that considered humans nothing more than amusing pests to be exterminated on day 12. They lost Henderson to a patrol that appeared from nowhere on day 45. They lost Martinez and Cooper to a trap that should have been impossible to set one by one. Her unit fell, and one by one, Grace learned what it truly meant to be a hunter in the darkness. She learned to read the wind by watching how dust particles danced in the air. And she learned to predict enemy movements by understanding their psychology better than they understood themselves. She learned that technology could be fooled, but human instinct, sharpened by desperation and loss, could not be replicated by any machine by day 300. She was alone, and the enemy had begun to notice something strange happening to their forces. Officers would fall dead in their command centers with no warning. Patrols would enter valleys and never return weapons. Depots would explode after a single precise shot hit fuel containers from distances that their sensors said were impossible. They called her Morgul in their tongue, a word that translated roughly to the death that arrives from nowhere. And they began to fear the shadows themselves. confirmed elimination count reached 2,847, and intelligence analysts later estimated that her unconfirmed count was at least triple that number, but numbers never told the whole story on day 612. She discovered that the enemy was planning to destroy a civilian settlement to flush her out. Believing that her human compassion would force her to act, she acted, but not in the way they expected for 6 days. Grace held a mountain pass alone against an entire battalion, and each time they advanced, their soldiers fell without ever seeing where the shots came from. She did not sleep for those 6 days, and she did not eat for 4 of them, but she held that pass until 40,000 civilians escaped through the valley behind her when the Rexian commanders finally understood what one human had done to their forces. They committed 3 full divisions to hunting her down. They found nothing but empty positions and spent shell casings 147 days after her unit dropped behind enemy lines. Grace walked out of the wilderness and into a human forward base, and she carried with her enough intelligence to end the war within 6 months. The soldiers who saw her that day said she looked like a ghost. Given physical form, thin and pale and silent, with eyes that had seen too much death to ever fully return to the world of the living. That was 15 years ago, and Grace had spent those years training others, sharing the knowledge that had kept her alive when everything said she should have died. She did not train them in the academies or the official military schools. She trained them in the quiet places, the secret programs, the units that did not officially exist, and now she was here, on Station Helia 7, watching aliens laugh at her equipment while they had no idea who stood among them back in the observation deck. The other instructors had begun to access what little information they could find about Grace Holloway, and their reactions told Sergeant Harris everything he needed to know. A Kethany weapons master went pale beneath her scaled skin as she read the declassified portions of Grace's service record of Xurian Tactical. Instructor made a sound of disbelief as he saw the list of commendations that followed her name. Even the Sylphine commander who had questioned Harris now stood in shocked silence, her 4 eyes fixed on her data screen. "This cannot be accurate," the Sylphine whispered, and her voice trembled slightly. No single individual could have accomplished what these records claim. The records you can see are less than 10% of her actual service history, Harris replied, and he kept his eyes on the training floor below. "The classified portions would give you nightmares for the rest of your life, Commander. Why is she here, truly?" Harris turned to face the gathered instructors, and he saw fear in their eyes for the first time since he had known them. "The Galactic Council has detected something awakening in the outer reaches," he said, and his words fell like stones into still water. "Something that our energy weapons cannot touch. Something that can sense our electronic emissions from light years away. And something that nearly destroyed all civilization 100,000 years ago." The instructors exchanged glances of growing horror. "Only kinetic weapons can harm them," Harris continued. "Only primitive stealth can hide from them. And only humans still train in these methods that the rest of the galaxy abandoned as obsolete." He looked back down at Grace, who was now sighting through her rifle scope with the patience of a predator who had all the time in the universe. "She is not here to compete," Harris said. "She is here to evaluate whether any of you are worthy of learning what she knows, because when the Vinkari return, she cannot fight them alone." The first shot from the training floor echoed through the observation deck, and every instructor turned to watch what would happen next. Grace Holloway had begun her evaluation, and the aliens who had laughed at her were about to learn why humanity had earned its place among the stars, not through technology or numbers or luck, but through the simple, terrifying fact that humans never forgot how to be dangerous. The qualification course was designed by the finest tactical minds in the galaxy. and they had built it to be nearly impossible targets, appeared at random intervals across a shooting range that stretched 4,000 meters from end to end. And holographic wind generators created shifting air patterns that could change direction 3 times before a projectile reached its destination civilian. Holograms wandered through the target zones at unpredictable intervals, and a single shot that struck an innocent would result in immediate disqualification. The alien cadets approached this challenge with supreme confidence in their technology, and their smart rifles calculated thousands of variables while they're targeting. AI systems highlighted optimal firing solutions. Zorvix was the first to complete his run, and his 4 eyes had worked in perfect harmony with his plasma rifle to identify and eliminate targets that most species would never have seen. His final score appeared on the display board above the range. 847 out of 1,000 possible points. It was the highest score ever recorded by a Sylphine in this course, and Zorvix allowed himself a moment of pride as he stepped back from the firing line. Cathral followed with a score of 792. Respectable for his species, but frustrating for someone who considered himself the finest warrior in his generation. The other cadets completed their runs with scores ranging from 650 to 820, and each one felt satisfied that they had performed at the peak of their abilities. Then, it was Grace's turn. She walked to the firing line without hurry, and she carried her ancient rifle with the casual ease of someone holding an extension of their own body. No targeting helmet covered her head. No heads-up display fed her information about wind speed or target distance. No artificial intelligence whispered firing solutions into her ears. She had only her rifle, her eyes, her breathing, and 60 years of accumulated knowledge passed down through 4 generations of Holloway snipers. The course instructor Voss watched with barely concealed amusement, expecting this to be a brief and embarrassing display that would remind everyone why humans belonged in support roles rather than frontline combat. Begin when ready, Voss announced, and the first target appeared 300 meters downrange. Grace did not fire at it. She fired at a position 2 meters to the left of the target, and the alien observers began to laugh at what they assumed was a complete miss. Then, a second target appeared exactly where her shot had landed, and it shattered before it had fully materialized. The laughter died in their throats. Grace was not reacting to the targets as they appeared, and she was predicting where they would appear before the course computer had even made its decision. Shot after shot rang out across the range, and each one found its mark with a precision that the watching aliens could not comprehend at 2,000 meters. She compensated for a wind shift that had not happened yet, reading the subtle changes in dust patterns that told her what the air would do 3 seconds before it did it at 3,200 meters. She identified a decoy target that looked identical to a real one, and she ignored it while eliminating the actual target hidden behind a barrier. How is she doing this? Zorvix whispered to Kethral, and for the first time his voice carried no arrogance, only genuine confusion. The Rawl had no answer, and he watched with growing unease as the human woman dismantled every assumption he had ever held about the primitive species. The civilian holograms began to appear more frequently, moving through the target zones in patterns designed to create impossible shots. Grace navigated through them like water flowing around stones, and not once did her bullets come close to an innocent. Her rifle spoke in steady rhythm, each shot a conversation between her and death itself, and the sound echoed through the training hall like a heartbeat. The instructors in the observation deck had stopped speaking entirely, and they watched with the horrified fascination of prey animals witnessing a predator at work. Her accuracy is beyond what our models predict for human capability, the Sylphine commander said, and her voice was barely a whisper. Your models are based on average humans, Sergeant Harris replied. And there was something like pride in his voice. Grace Holloway has never been average on the range floor. The final scenario appeared, and every watching alien understood immediately why the course desires had included Ida. Hostage situation materialized at 3,800 meters, with 3 civilian holograms positioned in front of the target in a formation that left no clear firing line. The gap between the hostages measured less than 4 centimeters, and the target behind them was partially obscured by their bodies. The smart rifles of the alien cadets would have flagged this scenario as impossible and recommended alternative approaches. Grace did not hesitate. She adjusted her breathing, felt the weight of the rifle in her hands, and connected with that quiet place inside herself, where time seemed to slow and the universe became simple. The shot traveled 3,800 meters in just under 5 seconds, and it passed through the 4-centimeter gap without disturbing the air around the hostage holograms. The target shattered. The range fell completely. Silent Grace lowered her rifle and turned away from the firing line as her final score appeared on the display board. 1,000 out of 1,000, a perfect run on a course that the designers had mathematically proven could not be completed. Perfect. Lycathral stared at the score with his mandibles hanging open, unable to process what he had just witnessed. Soric's 4 eyes blinked rapidly as he tried to reconcile his understanding of physics with what the human woman had just accomplished. Thus, the course instructor looked down at her datapad as if expecting to find an error. But the numbers did not change no matter how many times she checked them. Grace walked back to her equipment station and began the careful process of cleaning her rifle. And she paid no attention to the stunned silence that surrounded her. She performed this ritual thousands of times before. After thousands of shots, and the familiarity of it brought her a peace that nothing else in the galaxy could provide. From the observation deck, Harris watched the alien cadets struggle to understand what they had seen, and he knew that their education had only just begun. The living ghost had announced herself, and now the real test would follow. The silence lasted for 37 seconds before Catherall shattered it with a roar of frustration. "This is some form of deception," he announced, his voice echoing through the training hall as he pointed an armored claw at Grace. "The human has tampered with the course computers, or your instructors have rigged this demonstration to embarrass us." The other alien cadets shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether to agree with the accusation or accept what they had witnessed. Grace continued cleaning her rifle without looking up, and her calm indifference seemed to enrage Catherall even further. "I demand satisfaction," the Vexorian declared, invoking the ancient right of his species to resolve disputes through combat. "Let us settle this in the hunt, where no computers or rigged systems can help you." Human. The hunt was a traditional Vexorian challenge, a simulated battlefield where 2 warriors stalked each other until one scored a decisive hit with non-lethal training rounds. Catherall had never lost a hunt in his entire career, and his species' natural armor, enhanced senses, and predatory instincts made him a terrifying opponent in close-quarters combat. From the observation deck, Sergeant Harris leaned forward with interest, and the other instructors exchanged worried glances. "Should we stop this?" the Sylphian commander asked, and genuine concern colored her voice. The Vexorian could seriously injure her, even with non-lethal rounds. Harris almost laughed, but he managed to keep his expression neutral. "I would be more concerned about the Vexorian," he replied. "But this is something he needs to experience for himself." On the training floor, Grace finally looked up from her rifle, and her gray eyes met Catherall's compound visual organs with the same calm emptiness they had shown all day. "Very well," she said, and her voice was soft but carried clearly through the silent hall. The simulation arena occupied the lower level of the training facility, A massive space filled with ruined buildings, scattered debris, and enough cover to hide an army holographic generators created atmospheric effects like smoke, dust, and shifting shadows. And sensor dampeners prevented either combatant from relying entirely on technological entered from the north entrance. His massive form moving with surprising grace for a creature of his size. And he activated his thermal imaging systems while his sound amplifiers scanned for any trace of movement. He was a born hunter, descended from apex predators who had ruled their homeworld for millions of years. And every instinct in his body told him that he would find and defeat this human within minutes. Grace entered from the south, carrying only her rifle and wearing no armor or sensor equipment of any kind. The timer began, and the hunt was on for the first 10 minutes. Catherall moved through the urban ruins like a shadow, checking corners and scanning rooftops with the methodical precision of a trained warrior. His thermal sensors showed nothing. His sound amplifiers detected nothing. His natural hunting instincts, honed through a lifetime of training, told him nothing. It was as if the human had simply vanished. Then a red dot appeared on his chest, projected by a targeting laser, and it held steady for exactly 3 seconds before disappearing. Phil spun toward the source, but there was nothing there. He moved to a new position, using cover to protect his flanks while his sensors worked overtime to find any trace of his opponent. 5 minutes later, another red dot appeared on his back, and again it held for 3 seconds before vanishing. He never heard her move, never detected her presence, never saw even a flicker of motion. The third dot appeared on his throat, the fourth on the gap between his armor plates where his secondary heart was located, the fifth directly between his compound eyes. Each time, the dot held for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to prove she could have taken the shot. And then it was gone. Catherall began to understand something that shook him to his core. She was not hunting him at all. She was teaching him. Every red dot appeared on a vulnerable point that his armor did not protect. And every disappearance proved that she could have ended this contest at any moment she chose. By the 12th dot, Catherall had stopped moving entirely, and he stood in the center of a ruined plaza with his weapons lowered and his pride in ruins. "Where are you?" he asked the empty air, and his voice carried none of the arrogance it had held before. "Behind you," Grace answered, and Catherall spun to find her standing 3 meters away. Her rifle pointed at the ground. His sensors had shown nothing. His thermal imaging had detected no heat signature, and his sound amplifiers had picked up no movement. She had appeared like a ghost made flesh, and he understood now why the human sergeant had called her by that name. "How is this possible?" Catherall asked, and genuine curiosity had replaced his wounded pride. "My sensors should have detected you from 100 meters away." Grace lowered her rifle completely and met his gaze with something that might have been respect. "Your technology tells you where I should be," she said, and her voice was patient, like a teacher addressing a student who was finally ready to learn. "Your instincts tell you where I could be, but you never learned to feel where I am." "Feel?" Catherall repeated, confused by the concept. "The air moves differently when someone is watching you," Grace explained. "The shadows fall at slightly wrong angles when someone is hiding in them, and your own body knows when death is near if you learn to listen to it." She stepped closer, and Catherall resisted the urge to raise his weapons. "That is not something you can download from a computer or install in your armor," she continued. "That is something you earn through years of survival, in the dark places where machines fail and only your will keeps you alive." Catherall was silent for a long moment, processing everything he had experienced in the past hour. "I yield," he said finally, and the words came easier than he expected. "I have been a fool, and I apologize for my disrespect." Grace nodded once, accepting his surrender and his apology with equal grace. "Foolishness can be cured," she said, And something warm entered her voice for the first time. Pride is only fatal when it prevents learning. And you have shown that you are willing to learn. She turned and walked toward the arena exit, pausing only to look back at the massive Vexorian warrior. "Report to Training Room 7 tomorrow at dawn," she said. "Your real education begins then." The assembly hall of Station Helia 7 had never been so quiet, and the cadets from 12 different species sat in perfect stillness as they waited to understand what they had witnessed. Grace Holloway stood at the front of the room, and for the first time since her arrival, she seemed willing to speak more than a few words. Beside her stood Sergeant Harris and the station commander, an elderly Cathany named Admiral Vexara, who had fought in wars that most species had forgotten. "What you experienced today was not a competition," Admiral Vexara began, and her forearms were folded in the formal posture of serious announcements. "It was an evaluation. And I regret to inform you that the circumstances which brought it about are grave indeed." The alien cadets exchanged confused glances, still processing how their assumptions about humans had been so completely shattered. 37 days ago, our long-range sensor arrays detected movement in the outer darkness, the Admiral continued. Energy signatures that match records from 100,000 years ago, from the war that nearly ended all civilization in this galaxy. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and even Kethral, who had faced his humiliation with growing wisdom, felt a chill run through his armored body. "The Vankari are awakening," Admiral Vexara said, and the name fell like a curse upon the assembled warriors. Every species in the galaxy knew the stories of the Vankari, passed down through generations as warnings and nightmares. They were ancient beings of terrible power, immune to energy weapons of all types, and they possessed the ability to sense electronic emissions from distances that defied understanding. When they had last walked among the stars, they had consumed entire civilizations, and only a desperate alliance of now extinct species had managed to force them into hibernation. "Our plasma rifles will not harm them," the Admiral explained. "Our smart weapons will betray our positions. Our sensor networks will guide them straight to our worlds. And everything we have built our military doctrine upon will become useless." She turned to Grace, and respect filled her ancient eyes. "But there is one species that never forgot the old ways," Admiral Vexara said. "One species that still trains its warriors in kinetic weapons and primitive stealth, not because they lack technology, but because they understand that some threats require older solutions." Grace stepped forward, and every eye in the room focused on the small human woman who had dismantled their pride with patient precision. "The Vankari cannot sense kinetic projectiles," Grace said, and her voice carried clearly through the silent hall. "They cannot detect warriors who carry no electronic emissions, and they cannot predict the actions of minds that rely on instinct rather than artificial intelligence." She paused, letting her words sink into the consciousness of the assembled aliens. "Humanity has spent centuries refining these skills, not because we are primitive, but because we learned long ago that the universe is full of threats that cannot be defeated by technology alone." Kethral leaned forward in his seat, and understanding began to dawn in his compound eyes. "You are here to teach us," he said, and his voice carried none of the mockery it had held before. "To prepare us for what is coming," Grace nodded, and something like approval flickered across her features. "The training will be unlike anything you have experienced," she said. "You will learn to shoot without targeting systems, to move without sensors, to think without artificial assistance. And many of you will fail. Some of you may even die during the exercises." She looked across the crowd, meeting the eyes of species who had laughed at her just hours ago. "But those who survive will become something new," she continued. "Warriors who combine the natural advantages of your species with the hard-won wisdom of human survival. And together, We will form the first line of defense against an enemy that has slept for 100 millennia." The hall remained silent as the weight of her words settled upon them. Then Kethral stood, his massive form rising from his seat like a mountain emerging from the sea. "I volunteer," he said, and his voice rang with conviction. "I have seen what human training can accomplish, and I will not let pride prevent me from learning what I need to know." Zorvix rose next, his 4 eyes blinking with determination. "My species has always valued knowledge above all else," the Silthine said. "And the knowledge this human carries is worth any price." One by one, cadets from every species rose to their feet, and their voices joined together in a chorus of commitment. Grace watched them stand, and for a moment the weight of her past seemed to lift from her shoulders. She had carried the burden of humanity's survival for so long, and now others were stepping forward to share that weight when the last cadet had volunteered. Grace turned to Sergeant Harris, who stood watching with quiet pride. "Think they have what it takes?" Harris asked, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. "No," Grace replied, and honesty colored her words. "But they will, because that is the human way. And we break ourselves against impossible odds, and we rebuild stronger. And now we will teach others to do the same." Harris nodded, understanding the depth of what she was saying. "And if the Venkari come before they are ready?" he asked, voicing the fear that lurked in every strategic mind on the station. Grace checked her rifle, running her fingers along the worn stock in the same way her grandmother had done, and her mother after her, and her own hands had done 10,000 times before. "Then I hold the line," she said, and her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who had faced death so many times that it had become a familiar companion. "That is what Holloways do." She walked toward the exit, pausing at the door to look back at the cadets who would soon become her students. "Training begins at dawn," she announced. "Rest well tonight, because you will not have the luxury of rest again for a very long time." The door closed behind her, and Grace Holloway walked alone down the corridor, a ghost among the living, carrying the weight of galactic survival on shoulders that had never learned how to surrender. Behind her, the future of the galaxy, prepared to learn the oldest lesson humanity had to teach. That true strength comes not from the weapons you carry, but from the will that refuses to break. And in the outer darkness, ancient eyes were opening for the first time in 100,000 years. Hungry and patient and utterly unaware that humanity had been preparing for their return since before the first Venkari had closed its eyes to sleep. The living ghost had found her army, and the universe would soon remember why it had learned to fear the small, stubborn species from a deadly world called Earth.